Hey writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. I'm Rachel, I am one of your hosts, and I am an author engagement manager at Kobo Writing Life. On today's episode, Laura and I chatted with Nicki Pau Preto, a best-selling author who lives just outside of Toronto, though her dislike of hockey, snow, and geese makes her the worst Canadian in the country. She studied art and art history in university and worked as a graphic designer before becoming a writer full-time. She is the author of the Crown of Feathers trilogy, the House of Dead duology, and her forthcoming middle grade debut, The Last Hope School for Magical Delinquents. Laura and I had so much fun chatting with Nicki about all things fantasy. We talked about her writing process, her transition from writing primarily YA into middle grade and the differences, and we really got into the nitty-gritty of world building. If you like fantasy, if you want to write in a fantastical world that includes world building, I cannot recommend listening to this enough. She had so much advice, so many insights, and I really think you're going to enjoy. We are joined today by author Nicki Pau Preto. Nicki, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And just to kick things off, can you please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Oh, sure. So I am a Canadian, science fiction and fantasy author, mostly fantasy. I have a YA epic fantasy series called Crown of Feathers. It's already out. And my currently running series is called The House of the Dead, with the second book, Ghostsmith, comes out in August of this year. And I also have a middle grade fantasy coming out in the fall. So I've been busy. But like I said, I'm from Toronto, just north of Toronto. And I guess that's my rundown.
Did you always know that you wanted to be a writer, or was it something that came later on in life?
Definitely late. I mean, later, I think, compared to most authors. I'm very much a reluctant reader, and I was not reading as a kid. So I didn't read my first novel until I was 17, which I think surprises people who are, because most people who are writers were very voracious readers as kids. And that just wasn't me. I honestly think I wasn't being handed the right books, not to put the blame on anyone else. But I think if someone had handed me, one of my first books I ever read, the first book I ever read was Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass. And then I also really loved Tamara Pierce around that era. So I think Tammy Pierce. So anyway, I think if someone had handed me those, it would have blown my world wide open, which it did when I was 17. But I think I just wasn't picking up the right stuff at a young age. And then interestingly, I was always very creative and very artistic. So I think I had all the pieces, but I wasn't reading. So I wasn't getting to wanting to be a writer until I started to love reading. I was very imaginative. I loved playing make-believe. I remember playing make-believe when I was maybe too old to be playing make-believe. And it's that was the start of world building, right? That was me inventing worlds to run around in. And if I had been reading, I think I would have wanted to be a writer sooner, but it didn't really come to me till the last piece of the puzzle, which was the reading. So I think that's late for most authors, I think. Like I said, most are I was 5 years old, I was writing books, and that just wasn't really me. More of a teen age, which might be why, I write teen novels. That was the first thing I've been published in, because that was my formative becoming a writer and becoming a reader age. So
that was actually my next question, what drew you to YA fantasy? So yeah, that's interesting to think of. That's the novels you read first, and maybe that is what you're drawn to.
And I do think there's something kids' books in general. We've all been kids, so I think it's easy to relate to, books for younger people. And I think a lot of the themes of self-discovery, all that is very evergreen to me. And I feel I'm every day still trying to figure out who I am. So I always identify, I think, with books for younger readers. But yeah, I do, looking back, it's hard to say. Most authors who were reading when they were, middle grade age, they don't always turn out to be middle grade writers. I think maybe I think also I came of age during the big YA boom, when it really became a category, and it was such an exciting place to read and therefore to write. It just felt like things were being done there that weren't really being done in other genres or age categories. And I know, I love epic fantasy, but a lot of the adult epic fantasy didn't necessarily speak to me. I found, and it's changed a lot, but there were a lot of, male narrators, and they tended to be a little older. And like I said, Tamara Pierce is one of the first, authors I truly loved. And these female-led epic fantasies blew my mind. So I think it really spoke to me when I was coming up and deciding I wanted to write. And then, it still speaks to me. But yeah, I think combination of me becoming a reader at that age, but also that category kind of coming into its own while I was deciding I wanted to be a writer. Like it kind of went hand in hand. So like there was nothing more exciting to me than like the newest YA books and stuff. Like, you know, I was a little bit older, like end of high school into university, but oh man, like it was such a fun, that was like Hunger Games era, Twilight era, like so much was so much exciting stuff in the movies, and it was so fun. So I wanted to be a part of it, you know?
It's totally like the golden age of YA. Like I feel like it was like the midnight release parties, like everyone was reading the same books. It was just like everyone was talking about the same books. So
truly, and I mean the internet was kind of coming of age then too.
Yes.
So communities online, like it was just so fun to like connect with other readers and, you know, writers too. But I think the reader part of me really like loved that era as well. It was just so exciting. And yeah, just, I don't know, it felt very like, yeah, like exciting and new. And I think it was a real revelation to me to realize that these authors were young women. Like generally the books are handed in school were written by people who are dead or long, you know, like old people, like and men, like it was like it like blew my brain to like realize that there were young women writing these books right now. Like publishing is happening now. I think, and that sounds silly, but as a kid, like I said, these books were all old. They'd all been around for, you know, decades. It didn't occur to me that like this is happening now and you could be a part of a series as it comes out. It was just like, I don't know, just when you're young, like everything feels new. And that was a new like revelation for me. And it was so exciting. And then, yeah, you could go on the internet and like follow your favorite author and like see what they're doing. I don't know. It just like, it was so wild to me and exciting. So exciting.
We really don't do midnight releases like we used to.
Oh, honestly,
You know?
It's been a long time, right? And I think that people miss that. I think that's why people love the big books, because they want to connect with other people. So it's exciting to find that community. And yeah, even like midnight release movies, like I remember going to see movies like Hunger Games or whatever it was. Like, you know, it was just so fun to find your community in the like reading. So yeah, those were the days.
They really were.
They really were the good old days.
And we're like definitely going to dive into the House of the Dead and into Ghostsmith, your second book specifically. But first, I'm so curious because you are now working in the middle grade space. And I'm curious how that transition has been kind of from a craft perspective, like shifting your narrative tone for a younger reader.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. Like I feel like I'm one of those people that like, I don't consciously think I'm writing this for a child. I guess I'm writing for the child in me. Like I'm writing for me, and I don't feel like I'm like switching, like, okay, time to, you know, not to be like to dumb things down, like not like that. Like I don't feel like I'm lessening my craft or like trying to make things simpler. I'm just like thinking of who I was as a kid and like appealing to her, I suppose. And I don't really like, I feel like it's just a matter of getting in the head of the character, however old they are or whatever they're going through. And so like it wasn't really a huge, I think the bigger shift for me was writing contemporary fantasy instead of epic fantasy. Just being able to use like certain words and references and things that are like fun, you know, that you can't do in fantasy, or you shouldn't, you know, it's harder to do in fantasy. And the length of the stories, because for some reason I write really long books, and it was, even my middle grade's kind of long for middle grade, but that was a nice, like things were sort of like faster, pacier, and it meant I had less like subplots and confusing stuff. So in some ways it was just like a relief to write something that was like shorter and lighter, and like it just felt like a different experience that way. But I guess even content wise, it is like there's more humor in it for sure. And that, again, that's just the choice, I think, of writing contemporary fantasy. If I was writing contemporary fantasy for YA or whatever, I think I would have experienced the same like shifts. So it's really fun to switch between the two. Like this is my first time doing like two books at once. So to write like House of the Dead like 1 week and then hand it in and switch over to this like light, fun middle grade. Like it was actually kind of nice because it was like a palate cleanser between the two. I think if I was writing two middle grades that were similar, or two YAs that were similar, that would have been like harder for me, but they were different enough that it felt like a nice change of pace. But you know, it was just so fun. I had so much fun writing it. Like I said, it was a nice like breath of fresh air compared to my other work, a little bit lighter, a little bit faster. And like, I don't know, it was such a treat, honestly. And I love middle grade. Like I think the best middle grade is like appealing to any age. Like there's something about it is so fun and adventurous. So that's what I was trying to do. And oh my God, I had such a fun time doing it. It's such a fun world.
And I imagine something a little bit lighter after something with the heavy themes of House of the Dead, as the title kind of lends itself to, must have been refreshing.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, my narrator in House of the Dead is quite funny, and like she's maybe like takes some things lightly, even though maybe she shouldn't, like they are. But it's yeah, just like story wise, the characters, the kind of story it is, just yeah, there was enough difference. I think it made it, like I said, a bit easier to switch between the two. It might have been harder to juggle stories that were more similar or like appeal to a more similar like readership. But yeah, it was fun. It was hard to do two at once for sure, but it was, I think they were good to pair together, weirdly.
And what has your publishing experience been like? Has there been anything that's really surprised you about the industry?
Oh, yes. I mean, I was really lucky. I think a lot of debut authors get like a real slap to the face once they're published because so much of it's very mysterious, right? It's a weird job. Like most people know nothing about it. And I still experience that, people in my regular life. But I was really lucky that I had author friends who were already published. So I think I had my eyes a little like more wide open than a lot of debut authors do. I was lucky that I had already kind of built up a community. So I wasn't like totally shocked by some of just, the weirder things about it. But like one of the things I remember being the most strange is, just the whole social media component and how you can interact directly with your readers and like they'll interact with you while they're reading your book. And that's just a weird, like, I hadn't really considered that. And there's like, stuff you'll do in the story and they get mad at you and they will tell you about it. And I was like, oh, and then, I'm like, well, I think you should hope you keep reading. Like, I don't know. It's a weird to like interact with people as they progress through your book. Like I was like, oh, I hadn't really prepared myself for that. And social media in general, I think is like a hard, big component of the industry now. More and more, it seems that I still struggle with it. It can take up a lot of your time and it can be a lot of wasted time, seemingly. I think you can really get sucked into it. And we have to remind ourselves at the end of the day, our job is to actually write the books. And marketing the books is, kind of needs to be secondary if you want to keep having more books out. But, that's something that's always changing. So I think that's going to be true for every new author every year, finding out how to deal with like the internet element of being an author. But I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff. It's hard to think, it's just every book is different. Every publisher is different. Like there's always like new experiences, good and bad, that you can't really prepare for, I think. But like I said, I had author friends ahead of me on the journey. So that was really nice because they could, I could ask them for advice. And similarly, like they had told me some of their horror stories. So I felt like I was like maybe more prepared than some, luckily.
And what does your writing process look like? Do you plot beforehand or are you more of a pantser?
I'm very much a plotter.
I feel like that lends itself to fantasy.
Yes. I mean, even just to publish professionally, it's, to sell new things, you have to generally like have a synopsis. And like, I think it's helpful to be able to do it to a certain degree. But I also think every writer I know is a bit of both. Like I see it very much as like a spectrum, and I think we're all a little bit of both. So as much as I love to outline, I think as like an anxious person, it soothes me. I'm like, okay, I've thought this through. I know what I'm doing. But then when you write, you don't know what you're doing and things fall apart always. So you always have to like pants to some degree, or you have to be like flexible and pivot. And like, so it's always a mixed bag for me. But the pre-thinking, the brainstorming, the outlining, that's like some of my favorite stuff to do because I think it's freeing. I think like once the story's nailed down, it's a bit harder to like envision it differently. And by nailed down, I mean like written. It's harder to part, like, kill your darlings. It's harder to part with things. It's harder to see it from all angles. But when I'm brainstorming and outlining, I'm like, oh, what about this? What about that? And it feels sort of easier because nothing is set in stone yet. So for me, that's a really like fun part of the process. But I know for some authors, they hate that. Like they can't do it. They hate it. And they need to follow their intuition more, or they need to write it to know how they feel about it. And like all that's totally legitimate. And I think we're all, like I said, we're all a mix, but you got to do what works for you. And each book is different too, which is fun to discover. Like you might think you have your process nailed down, and then you write a next book and you go, whoa, like my process isn't working for me anymore. So you have to be willing to try new things and to sort of be kind with yourself if it doesn't work, even though it's always worked before, or, trying a new thing and hey, suddenly it works for me now and it didn't. Like, I think there's just always going to be that element of like, I don't know, like having to be flexible and having to discover new tricks, new things. Like every book truly is different. Every book asks something different from you. So, even if you've always, like, I know people who were always pantsers and then they kind of start plotting because they're published now and they find that it helps. Or conversely, like people who've been too rigid need to like let go and let themselves, like, trust themselves, trust the process, which is probably me. I have to like stop being so rigid and let myself go a little. But yeah, I think we're all a mix, but I'm definitely a plotter, I think, by nature, and then a little pantsing thrown in for fun.
And I think that's really good advice for like writers at all stages, is to be flexible, and what works for one person isn't going to work for you, but also what's worked for you in the past might not always work. And I think that portion is talked about less.
Right. And I think it's important to be open to trying new things. Like, you know, I love listening to other writers talk about their process, because at times you're like, oh, that sounds cool, I'm going to try that. Or like sometimes it's like, oh, that sounds horrible, please don't ever make me do that. Like pantsing, 100% pantsing, like fills me with horror. So, you know, like you have to like know who you are, but be, oh, maybe I'll try that. Like I did try to pants a book once and I fizzled out at like 40,000 words and I didn't know what to do. And like that was, you know, it's a learning, like that was helpful for me to know. But yeah, I think it is good to like embrace the fact that you will never really know what you're doing. Like there will always be like 75% I know what I'm doing and 25% chaos. For every writer I've ever met, like they're like, yeah, I don't know. Like there's always, you have to like make room for that, unfortunately.
I think that's a great soundbite. You never really know what you're doing. Writing
You
advice.
never really know. You really don't. Like I thought I would. I think if anything, you feel worse because like ignorance is bliss, and the longer you do it, you're more aware of your shortcomings. You're more aware of like how hard it is. Every book is a slog, and so in some ways it like gets harder. You have maybe more confidence in yourself, but you also recognize, like, you know, it feels like sometimes you barely pull through. Like, oh, I can't believe I survived that book, you know, and like that feeling I don't think ever truly dissipates. At least not for me. I'm not super far in my career yet, but I'll have 6 books out at the end of this year, and I still feel, you know, like I'm sort of like white knuckling it through to a certain degree. And, you know, I think I have to like, you have to become okay with that a little.
And you mentioned up at the top that even though you weren't always a voracious reader and writing wasn't always like your end goal, you've always been creative. And you actually, correct me if I'm wrong, have a degree in art and art history. And I'm so curious how that background affects your writing.
Yeah, like I said, I was creative from a young age. The first thing I remember being good at was like drawing and art. And I went to school for art. I actually have a master's in art history. I was hoping to maybe teach it one day, but I really hated my master's. I did not enjoy academia, so I pulled shoot on that. But I think honestly, like the drive to create is just something I've always had, right? So I think that's definitely a part of wanting to make things. But I think more and more when I look back, I think my love of art history really informs my world building, in that like what I loved about art history was like the context for things. Like I loved looking at a painting and then looking at the society and the artists and the people who made it. And that is essentially like world building, right? Like thinking of a society, what makes it tick, what's like top of mind to them, their religious beliefs, the like social, political upheaval. Like there's all sorts of things you look at. And I think that informs my world building. You know, I always like, I've wondered, I'm like, I'm surprised I don't really have any ideas that like tie into art history, but I do think it's been really formative in my world building and how I look at it. Like, that's why I love to build a fantasy world, because it just, I don't know, that stuff makes me tick and I find it fascinating. Like art history is like the stories behind the art, and that kind of feels like what world building is. So that's what I think. Ultimately, it also taught me to write long form. Although I used to like shudder at writing like 4,500 word essays. Oh no. And now it's like a daily word count sometimes when you're on a deadline. It's just kind of funny how like, you know, your perspective changes. But yeah, I think the world building is probably the most like, that's the easiest line I can draw between the two. And I think that explains my interest in it.
I think if somebody had explained to me that art history was like real life world building, I would have done much better in my art history classes.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, I love history, but I think history alone can be very dry. But I loved art history because there's pictures, but also because it was like little snapshots and like it was like leapfrogging through history without like getting the sort of gist of an era, and like it's exemplified in the art. Like, I think it's a really unique way to come at history. So yeah, I don't know. Like I find sometimes, like I said, pure history can maybe like I struggle with that sometimes, but art history I always adored. So yeah, I think there's something about tying it to imagery and just the whole like this sort of like art like industry, you know, like how some of these artists, like so many of them were poor, like, you know, their background, like it's fascinating on its own. But yeah, I think the leapfrogging through history, through images was like really fun for me. So yeah.
History with pictures is such a good slogan for art history. Like,
Right?
I feel like you could totally sell more art history majors that way.
I should, yeah, they should hire me to like,
Yeah.
promote my school. I actually just heard from my old art history professor. She's like, oh, you're published. I didn't know. I thought that was fun because I haven't heard, I haven't really been in touch with anyone. So that was fun. But yeah,
That's
like
nice.
sign me up. I'll recruit your students.
Let's talk about Ghostsmith, which is the second book in the House of the Dead duology and is coming out in August. Can you tell our listeners a bit about the book and maybe the series for anyone who hasn't read it?
Right. So Bonesmith is about, there's basically a world where the dead don't leave their bodies willingly. So the land is kind of haunted and they need bonesmiths, which are people who have like a mastery, a magical connection over bones. They like sever the ghost's tie to their bodies to sort of make the world safe. So my main character is someone who's been training her whole life to be a warrior who basically fights ghosts to allow this to happen. And she gets kind of sabotaged and winds up kind of exiled. And in order to prove herself, she decides she's going to rescue this prince who's been kidnapped and taken beyond a wall, kind of like Jon Snow, Game of Thrones vibe. She thinks she's going to rescue him from this haunted wasteland and like prove herself. And I don't want to, spoil that book in talking about Ghostsmith, but, there's a lot of revelations, a lot of betrayals and backstabbing. And basically my main character has formed an alliance with these other two guys who basically have also been kind of betrayed, backstabbed, and they're setting out together once again beyond this wall into this haunted territory to kind of try and like fix the wrongs of their families. There's a lot of like family stuff and a lot of like confusing dynamics and stuff. Lots of dead, lots of ghosts, cool new magic. I think I definitely went off the rails with the magic in the second book. I just like let myself go. So it's weird. Yeah, there's my pitch for it. Weird, unhinged. I've been known to call it. And I think that actually fits the bill.
We've been reading the series, and I feel like that's a good description for someone who doesn't want spoilers.
Right. It's always scary trying not to spoil yourself. I'm like trying to think what's on the back cover. But yeah, I mean, it's a duology. The second book picks up like right where the first one left off. So it's very much like a unified kind of single story and fast pace, lots of action, which is true of the first one as well. And yeah, it's a mess that the Ren and her allies are trying to clean up, but it gets messier before the story's through.
Did you always know it was going to be a duology?
Actually, I tried to sell a trilogy, but my publisher only wanted to buy 2. And then, maybe I could sell the third. And that's a scary place to be in as a writer. The same thing happened with my first series. They bought 2, and then eventually turned into 3, but that's not a guarantee. And I think, like I said, being slightly further in my career made me maybe a little more wiser. Like I just didn't like the idea of not knowing what I was signing up for. So I decided, I'm like, okay, if you only want to buy 2 right now, then I'm just going to write 2. So I had a lot more ideas for this world. And sometimes that's like hard to live with because I don't think I went to every nook and cranny I could have. But in other ways, it forces you to be more focused. And I think that's part of what people like about the story is it's got, like I said, good pacing and it's kind of fast. And I tend to sprawl. Like the Crown of Feathers series is very sprawling. And I think, by only doing 2, I was forced to be a little more, focused. But it's hard too, because like I said, there's like cool stuff I want to do that I didn't get to do. But it was really, I think like once I made that decision, I was happy with it. And it allowed me to zero in on the things that mattered. And like I said, make a pacey, fast story. And I think it suits kind of my main character. It suits the world. So I'm happy with that decision. But, initially, I think trilogies in fantasy were sort of conditioned. Like for so long, it was always trilogies. And I think that's like the way my brain works. And even like story structure, it's like 3 acts. Like I think a lot of times that's like the default. But so it was a new challenge writing a duology because like I remember for Crown of Feathers, the first book, you're like setting up a bunch of stuff. And the second book, you're like having to reckon with that, but you still need to open up new mysteries and create new things. And then the third book is like really hard to close all that up again. Whereas in only 2 books, I was like, I'm just starting to set things up, but recognizing that by the next book, I have to close them. So I couldn't be too like, let's throw that in there and see what happens. It had to be a little more like circumspect, I guess. So like it was a new challenge as a writer and it was fun. But I think it was good and bad. Like, I feel like I could write a lot more stuff in the world, but it made me be a little more, yeah, like considering how I was going to wrap things up before I introduced them. Whereas I think in my trilogy, I just chucked stuff in there and I was like, I'll figure it out later. So for better or worse.
When we're done recording, I'm going to ask what else would have been in the duology because I'm so curious because I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you.
But I'm curious where the inspiration for this came from because like you said, a lot of dead, a lot of ghosts, a lot of magic.
Well, it's really funny because I did not set out to write a ghost book at all. I came at this world, I mean, interestingly, like I feel like I usually start more with characters, but in this case, I started with like plot. I had this idea of two enemies allying on a rescue mission. I was like, okay, they're going to, traverse some dangerous place to rescue someone. So that's where I started. And then I decided to make it a prince they were going to rescue because it just feels like a fun little switch of the like damsel, trope. I'm like, oh, they're going to rescue a prince and not a princess. And then I started to ask myself, okay, like what's the dangerous territory? Like, what are they, what are we dealing with here? And I was also tinkering with like a magic system. I thought I would do something like I was inspired by elemental magic. So like a great example is Avatar: The Last Airbender. That's a great take on elemental magic. And I loved that series. So I was like kind of riffing on that, but I wanted to do something that wasn't elemental because it is quite common. And I was like, what can I do that's different? And my brain, this is like what I was saying. I love the pre-writing stuff. I love the brainstorming stuff because I have so much fun with it. So I was just like, okay, like what else can I do? Maybe, like other elements, things that come from the ground. I was like, okay, like metals come from the ground. Cool. And I love metal magic. Like Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson is a favorite of mine. It's incredible world building, incredible magic system if you're ever looking for a cool magic system. So I was like, okay, metal and like, okay, stone and like wood comes from the ground too. And I was kind of tinkering with that. And then for some reason, like bone popped into my head because we bury our dead, we bury bones. And then that just like, and I was like, oh my God, okay. If you're dealing with bones, you're dealing with ghosts. And then everything kind of came from that. So that was not what I set out to do, but suddenly I was so intrigued by that. And then, okay, if you're dealing with bones, you're dealing with dead. What kind of dead? Ghosts. And it all like the ghost, like the House of Bone stuff all came together really fast for me, like their magic system and just their world, their aesthetic, like everything just kind of happened really quickly for them. And then I tried to make the other houses like round them out to kind of match that. But theirs is the coolest, for sure. And like that was what made me really excited. And then I started thinking about the characters, which again, characters are usually first for me, but like what kind of person would, what would the person be like? And, Ren is like one of my favorites. And a lot of people seem to really like Ren. She's funny and she's like brash and bold and like arrogant. Like she knows who she is and she owns it. And I think that's like really appealing. And it's appealing to me. Like I wish she was my friend. I think she's funny and she'd be super fun, like to have a drink with or something. But she just felt perfect for that whole aesthetic. Like it was sort of, I don't know, like goth, some people call it, and like rock and roll a little. Like, I don't know. She just felt perfect for that. So like I came at this kind of backwards from the way I normally do. But once I landed on the bone stuff, like that's where everything kind of came together. And that came from like just exploring, following ideas till the end, like tinkering and messing around. And then I end up writing a series about like ghosts and stuff. And that was not what I set out to do at all. So there you go. That's the pantser in me, right? I was like trying to be all organized and have it all set up. And then, oh, hey, bones, ghosts, let's go with it.
Let's talk about that world building a little bit more because like you said, you have the magic systems, the history, the conflicts. How do you balance that with the actual story itself and avoid doing like an exposition dump?
Well, I have been accused many times of info dumping, so I'm not sure I'm the best to answer this. It's just so funny because I think the standard, like I write YA. What's called info dumping in YA is not info dumping in adult fantasy, right? Like adult epic fantasy, info dumping is like what people want because they want to know how everything works. They want to understand the world. So I always struggle because I think I do a ton of world building like outside of the novel. I do tons of documents and because it's fun for me. And I just like, I'll write histories and timelines and, whole like treatises on the magic and all sorts of crap. But then conveying it in the story is really hard. What to convey and when, and that's something I always struggle with. And again, the conventions of what category you're writing in. I will say one thing with my middle grade stories, I had way too much like magic stuff in there. Like we had to scale it way back. It would have been confusing for anyone, not just middle grade readers. Like I really just like overdid it. But so like depending on what you're, and again, it's a contemporary story. Like I think depending on the genre you're writing in, you have to, rein yourself in or push yourself to do more if world building isn't your thing and you're trying to write like an adult epic fantasy, like those readers expect a lot. So I do a lot because I enjoy it and that's like one of my favorite parts, but I have to scale it back personally for writing in YA because YA comes with an expectation of pace, a certain pacing and a certain accessibility, I think, a certain manner of storytelling that is maybe different in adult or middle grade or whatever you're doing. So finding how, like the balance of how to convey it is something I'm still struggling with. Like I said, I get accused of info dumping all the time. And then, but some people love it, right? And I can only write for people who like what I like. So reining it in is really hard. And I don't really have like a great solution there. I think having, I'm lucky I have an editor, right? People you work with that hopefully can help you point out where you're like maybe overdoing it. But I do think like for a lot of writers, I think world building is really daunting. And I think for me, it's an indulgence. I really enjoy it. So like if you don't enjoy it, like then that's like me for plotting. I don't enjoy plotting. So I do what I need to do to make my story work. And that's it. Like, I don't enjoy plotting. Like, I have to try really hard to plot. My first book ever had 0 plot. So, like, that's my weakness. So if world building is your weakness, you're going to have to just do enough to make your world make sense. Whereas for me, I find a lot of pleasure in it. But it is hard. I think we need to, for epic fantasy, but any fantasy really, like everything informs everything, right? Like I was saying, Ren is who she is because she's a bonesmith, because she was raised in the House of Bone. So it's hard, you can't fully, like she can't exist without her backstory, without the world building. So I think we all are like doing it in our heads when we're creating a character or we're creating the plot, like whatever it is you lead with. It's just like teasing it out and making sure it makes sense, making sure like logic is a big part of it. And again, I think I enjoy picking at logic flaws and stuff, even though it's like makes me like breaks my brain sometimes. Like I hate the way I am sometimes because I cannot let it go if it doesn't make perfect sense. And my friend, a good friend of mine who's a writer, she's like, Nicki, it's just a story. But I'm like determined to make, like I really like overthink everything. So, I mean, it is good and bad, but I think they're like every story, like they all, like it's the foundation, right? The world building is kind of the foundation and the circumstances that make your character and make your story make sense. So if you haven't done a base level of like fleshing things out, and it's a matter of just asking yourself questions. And when I read for newer writers, it's just kind of, and this is what my editor does for me, like why? Like why do they do things that way? And it's like, it's exhausting sometimes, but you have to step back and go, yeah, like why? Like, I wanted for example, Ren and the Bonesmiths, I wanted them to wear cool black eye makeup. I thought it looked fun and like edgy and goth, right? So I'm like, okay, I need to explain this. I can't just put black paint on her and that's it. So I explained that it's like eye black and it reduces glare from ghosts because ghosts glow. Cool. Like that's some world building that informs the aesthetic of my character and it all makes sense. If I don't explain that, it kind of feels like flat. I also wanted her to carry swords made of bone. Why? Because bone repels ghosts. So it's the ideal, weapon to fight a ghost. Like, it's just a matter of like taking your decisions and like examining them and making sure that they have like justification, a reason. Like, why is there this big haunted territory that is behind a wall? Like, who built the wall? Why is it there? Like, you just kind of have to poke. Like, it's great to have these crazy ideas that come from like the brain stew in your head, like some Game of Thrones, some whatever it is that like has like, piled up and mixed around in your brain over time, but you have to be able to pull on the threads and ask why a lot. And maybe you don't need like your answer why. My answer why there was a wall was like a 10-page history document. I did not put 10 pages of history in the book. So like, it's kind of like that iceberg thing. Like, the story shows you an inch, but there's, miles below that you, the writer, has to know, and you have to work on that and make sure you understand it. So your decisions moving forward, align with that. So it is a lot of like work that no one sees. But for me, there's satisfaction in that because I think like setup and context is like massive for why story beats land, So I enjoy that process, even though it can be tedious. But yeah, you come up with these cool ideas, you better be able to kind of explain why things are the way they are. And that's satisfying and hard. And yeah, just depending, if it's not your thing, you're going to do the bare minimum and that's totally fine. But for me, I do like way too much. And then I have to figure out how to not dump it all in my book. So we all have our journeys. We all have our struggles.
I was worried this next question was going to be like weird and too specific, but based on what you just said, I think it's not. So what I found really fascinating about the book is that, especially in Bonesmith, the characters are almost taught different versions of the same history. And so I'm curious how that came to be within the writing process. Did you always know about these two different truths, or did you know the like actual history and then build the web of lies afterward?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did mention Game of Thrones as being inspiring. Almost, I think every book idea I've ever had has been inspired by Game of Thrones in some way. I really adore the books and the show until like the last couple seasons. So I think the concept of the wall, early in the show or the books, you have the Seven Kingdoms on one side and the wildlings on the other, and immediately like the concept is about them having like those people just happen to be on the wrong side of the wall, right? Like that's a concept kind of inherent from Game of Thrones. So I think I kind of borrowed from that. Like, okay, there's going to be this wall. There's going to be different stories on either side of what this history is. And I think that's, to be fair, I think I explore that in general in my stories. Like, there is no one truth, I don't think. Like, I think if there's, if good and bad is really simple, if, like the lines between the good guys and the bad guys are really crystal clear, it kind of becomes a little, not boring, but like sort of flat maybe, or not as interesting as it could be. So I think I'm always looking to do that. I think I do that whether or not I like intend to, like, I don't always set out. It's just what I do naturally. But I did have a document with 2 columns where it was like the Bonesmith side of things and like the other side of the wall side of like the Ironsmith side. Like I was consciously doing that because I was like, where are we deviating here, just to make sure, because I don't actually know. I think that's one of the funny things too. Like, as much as I do tons of world building and I write these historical documents, they tend to change while I tell the story, because I think whoever's doing the telling and like affects the way the truth comes out. So like, I don't know, like sometimes people will ask me like, oh, like the real truth. And I'm like, I only know the truth according to the characters. Like, I don't know if and that's the same with our own world history, right? Like there is no absolute truth. It's who's doing the telling. And I think that's unconsciously kind of how I approach my world history. Like it's all about who's doing the telling. I did the same thing in the Crown of Feathers series. Like there's a lot of like what things people like have been told, which aren't true. And there's different sides to everything. And I think that's just something I like to play with. So like, I think I do it naturally, but I did specifically set out in, like Bonesmith, like I had this big history document, 2 columns, like where things were wrong and right. And, I think that's, and I mean, I think there's like at least 3 perspectives on that by the end of the series. Like, you get other people's side of things, maybe even 4, like every character has their own, like what they've been taught, what they believe. And then I like, messing with that. Like Ren definitely goes through that a lot. So much of what she's been told is not right. And she gets to see it, firsthand, hear it from other people, and it makes you question. I think that's like maybe a part of growing up a bit too, right? Like you think when you're young, your parents know all, or what, your teachers know everything. And as you get older, you're like, I'm an adult now and I don't know anything. Like we're all just sort of doing our best and like we all have our own biases. Like it just feels like real. And that's the way I like to tell stories, I think, to make sure that nothing is super, like I like the, the gray areas in everything, and especially in things like history and world building, because it is, as they say, like history is told by the victors. Like I think just depending on where you get your source of your information, there's going to be discrepancies. And that's like a fun place for, as a writer, to play with, and that inherently puts people against each other because what they think they know, sources of tension and stuff. So did I answer your question?
No, you did very well.
Did.
Yeah.
Good.
100%.
Oh, good.
And I have another question that's about your like less favorite part of writing, which is plotting. And with no spoilers at all, in Ghostsmith, there are kind of 3 different threads of story being told, especially in the second half of the book. Mm-hmm. How did you plot and pace it to ensure that those 3 story arcs kind of concluded at the same time? How challenging was that?
I hate it. So Crown of Feathers was multi-POV from the start. And by the end of the series, I had like 6 point of views. And like I wanted to like claw my eyes out. It's very hard to do multiple point of view. And I think I wouldn't have done it had I known better, but I didn't know better yet. So I leapt in as a baby debut and I made my first book super long and complicated, and I had to deal with the repercussions. So for Crown of Feathers, like when I knew it was going to be multi-POV from the jump, I kind of at the start of each book, I planned each thread kind of separately, right? And then, figuring out where to intercut them is a challenge and something I work on throughout the revision and everything. For Bonesmith, the extra point of view chapters are kind of minimal, and they kind of just came in at the end at my editor's request, and I really fought her on this because I did not want to do multi-POV again. But they're not quite the same. They're kind of like a chapter here, a chapter there. It's not the same as having like 4, 5, 6 individual story arcs. It was a little more like sporadic. But I knew then going into the second book, and that's the problem with multiple point of view. If you give someone that in the first book, like people want it again in the second, and they need stuff to do, kind of, right? And that's what I didn't want to fall into the trap of like having to come up with something for a character to do. But luckily from, early on, I knew there was going to be kind of like two climactic battles, and I was like, I can't have Ren at both. So I knew immediately that I'd have to sort of splinter off. And luckily, it just it happened naturally. And I think it made sense for the story. So it wasn't a ton of work, but I have struggled with that in the past, like how to make sure everyone gets a moment to shine, right? And again, when you have 6 POVs, that's really hard. This time, 3-ish, but like they're with each other. Like I think it was easier and it came more naturally. So then it was just a matter of kind of writing those scenes as I would anyway. And then, making sure your character is not just a spectator. Obviously, like that's just like story in general, like making sure they have something to contribute in these scenes. Like if this character is going here, like why them? And then making sure that it, it serves a purpose in the story. Intercutting, again, I feel like is something I mess around with a lot in revisions. Like it's not a perfect science, but you start to realize as you do a reread that maybe, the pacing overall isn't quite right, and you kind of move things, but then you have to be careful like what you reveal when, and like there's definitely like it is a lot of work, and it was very hard. Like I said, my first series, I don't think I would have done that if I had known how hard it would be. But I do find if you do it right, multiple point of view can be like really satisfying and give you really interesting perspectives that you couldn't get, right, just from one character. So whether it's, showing what the bad guys are doing or showing whatever, like I think it's more interesting than like having someone tell your character what happened or something, right? Like sometimes you just need it to convey certain things. So I think it happened kind of naturally with the direction the story was going for Ghostsmith. But it is a challenge, honestly. And it's something like, you need, I think that is another example. Again, I'm lucky I have an editor. Like it's really helpful to have extra eyes to help you see just, sometimes you forget who knows what, when, and like keeping track of and timeline stuff. Oh my God, timeline stuff. How long does it take to get from here to there in this scene? And oh my God, okay, I need time to pass. So I need this person to go to sleep, but oh my God. I know there's like software and stuff for that now. Apparently I'm gonna have to look into that because my process is not super scientific. It's kind of like, a scramble during my revisions to try and keep track of that stuff. So challenging, but rewarding, I think, if you can pull it off, and, gives people more characters to root for, I think. That's another benefit of having other perspectives and intercutting stuff. People get to know your characters better, and they have more people to root for, or more people to like hate. Like it just gives like depth, I think, if you can do it. But it can also, to be fair, like water down your main narrative. Like I think because if your plot is like, moving forward, every extra POV is kind of a sidestep. And if you sidestep too many times, your story can kind of stall out. So it's, I'm still figuring it out. I think I learned a lot doing the Crown of Feathers series, and it helped me, I think, a bit with this series. But, it's always, like I said, every book is a new adventure and a new challenge. So still working on that one.
The other thing about doing multiple POVs is I know sometimes as a reader, I'm reading a book with like a few different POVs, and sometimes there's one POV that I don't love as much as the others. And then you find yourself like, again, like skipping. So you also have to be careful with that as well. But
absolutely. Yeah. You can ruin someone's experience sometimes, right? Like if they don't like the character. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think you did a good job with this one for sure.
Oh, thank you. I mean, like I really fought my editor on it. I feel like a lot of writing is like, or at least for me, has been reacting to what I wrote before. So like I was determined not to do multiple POV because I had just done multiple POV. And like, even like I was saying earlier, like my middle grade was like light and fun and contemporary because I'm kind of like reacting to what I've been working on, which is Bonesmith and like that stuff. Like I feel like so much of it is like reaction. So I resisted it. But, I've seen most people seem to like it. I think Prince Leo is like a favorite. And so like he was very easy to write, and I get why people would want him. But in the first book, I'm like, his point of view doesn't need to be there. It doesn't. It provides some context, and he's fun to read. But like that's the struggle, right? Like sometimes, art is subjective. It's also not a science. Like I don't think there's a right or a wrong. And yeah, you're right. Like if people don't like the character, or they don't have enough to do, like I've seen that with my other series. Some people are like, didn't care about that plot thread, but cared about this one. And so it is, I think, a risk. And I remember as a reader, I used to hate multiple point of view, but I think, I eventually warmed up to it, but like maybe I'd read it done not great or something, right? Like it can be, you're asking the reader to keep investing in new characters when they become invested in the first one. And, it is, I think, sometimes a gamble, maybe. But again, it can really enrich your story. So I think if you make the choice for the right reason, and if you're able to write that way, sometimes people struggle to have like unique narrative voices for each character, right? So sometimes they kind of read the same, and that can muddy things as well. So it is a difficult thing to pull off, but again, can totally be worth it if you do it well.
For sure. I did want to talk about the whole cast of characters in the series a little bit, specifically your primary trio. So Ren, Leo, and Julian. How did you come up with these characters, and were you ever tempted to create a love triangle with the three of them, or?
Yeah, so I guess kind of like what I said, Ren came out of the world building. And I actually really struggled with her. It's funny. I wrote after I'd finished my Crown of Feathers series, I sat down to write the first Bonesmith chapters. And I did struggle to find Ren's voice. It's funny, in my first scene in Bonesmith, there's Ren, and her cousin Inara is kind of like an antagonist to her in this scene. And when I first wrote it, they were basically Veronica and Val from my last series, just because they had the same. And I was like, oh my God, I'm just writing what I had just been writing. Like I hadn't quite, she wasn't crystal clear to me yet. Because I was imagining her, in the story, her father's kind of dismissive, and I was imagining, and no one in her family, they kind of treat her poorly. So I was imagining someone kind of downtrodden and sad, and then she would go through this arc of becoming like strong, I guess. But I'm like, no, like it took me a minute to step back and go, no, Ren acts out because she's ignored. Like she doesn't wilt. She sort of like, she has a different, she's a different character. And once I understood that she acts out because she's treated this way, everything started to come together. And I'm like, no, she wouldn't just let her cousin say mean stuff to her. She'd shoot it back at her. And like, it completely changed the scene, but she hadn't fully formed for me yet. Or maybe I was just like too immersed in Crown of Feathers for too long. I hadn't like shaken it, but her, like understanding her that way really helped. And I did have to kind of step back and look at, like there's this great character book. I can't show it because this will be audio, but it's called Creating Character Arcs by K.M. Weiland. It's like one of the best books I've ever read on craft. And a lot of other books and like, formulas for character will talk about like the lie the character believes, like the thing that they want versus the thing they need. And like, you need to kind of understand them on a deeper level. And I think I took a step back and kind of looked at it. And once I understood her better, like suddenly she just blossomed, and she's been so like easy to write and fun to write. And like, I really like zeroed in on her goals and stuff, which is like, as a writer, sometimes you don't want to do that. Like, I don't want to do a character worksheet. Like, I don't want to, once I did that work, like it really paid off. And like I said, I think a lot of people really like Ren because she's a really well-defined character and her goals are really clear. And like, she really makes sense. And that was important. And I think once you have them nailed down, their complementary cast, like who they are, works in relation to who your character is. So by virtue of who Ren is, Julian would be kind of like the straight, she's like the jokester or whatever, and he's like the straight one. Like he's very stoic and kind of like judgy, and like that's like a great dynamic. They can't be too similar. Like that was a great dynamic to have them play off each other like that. And then the prince just like, sometimes you have a character that just walks on the page and you don't even really know. Like I didn't know who he was. I started to write like the scene where Ren and Leo meet is like basically the same from when I first wrote it. They just were. And it's so fun to see characters like sometimes they really become who they are when they're with another character. Like those two together, I was like, oh my God, these two. Like they were so easy to write. And I always like, I liked the idea that they would like flirt a little and have banter, but I never truly saw them as a romantic pairing or possibility. And I know some people wish they were, and some people are glad they seemingly aren't. But for me, it just wasn't, I really liked their friendship, and like I like that they could say, yeah, he's attractive. And he's like, yeah, she's attractive, but it's just not really what they're going for. And I think that's fun. And I don't know, they just weren't in my mind, especially, when they meet, I just thought, yeah, they're going to have a little banter. They're going to have a little fun, but that's not, it doesn't really serve the story. And it's not what I imagined. I always imagined that, Ren and this enemy, that was kind of what I was looking forward to writing. And yeah, I think Julian becomes who he is because of who Ren is. And then Leo is just like the wild card who just was who he was. And I was like, okay, cool. He's fun. Like, I don't know. And he was very easy to write, even from his perspective. Julian was harder. Sometimes you can know a character well from the outside, but then once you're in their head, it's sort of a different, like, I understand him through Ren's eyes, but through his own, I was like, oh, I had to like dig a little deeper there and make sure I kind of understood more about it, because he's mysterious, right? So it's easy to write from Ren, but then I had to be in his head. He's like, well, he can't be like a super mystery to himself. So I had to kind of, I've struggled with that before. Sometimes the character can be really easy to write from the outside, but then stepping in their head is harder. So he was more of a struggle, where Leo just, again, he came to me super easily for some reason. That's the way it goes. There's always like someone who's really hard, someone who's like super easy. Like, it's always a mixed bag. I wish it was always easy, but alas, nope.
I loved Leo, for the record. But I loved that they weren't a romantic pairing,
right,
because not all banter is flirting and not all flirting is serious, which I think more people need to understand.
Right. And I think, it's funny, like, they have a lot in common. And again, I didn't really like realize that until I start writing them and they're chatting. And I think there's like, Ren doesn't have any friends really, even though she's fabulous. But, she's kind of a loner. And like, there was something really nice about having their little connection and their friendship. And then what she, he's in danger, and like how she reacts to that. And, I just, if I had more books, like, I don't know, who knows what could, like, I always feel like anything is possible. Like, I don't like to shoot down people's like theories, or if they think, I'm like, maybe they could have dated. I don't know. But that's not what this story was. That's not what, they were flirting. They were having fun. Their friendship is what's important to them, especially in the first book. And like, that's just, I don't know, just felt right. Just kind of followed my instinct. But, I did worry, like, oh God, people are going to think it's a love triangle, and people love to hate on love triangles, even though they can be so fun. But yeah, that wasn't really my intention to do a love triangle. I mean, they're not together for like, a good portion of the book, right? She's going to rescue him. So kind of hard to make a romance between two people who aren't like together.
I wanted to kind of touch on the action in the books, because you mentioned that they're very action heavy, and they're action heavy both from like a hand-to-hand combat kind of vibe, and also from this fight is mostly being solved through magic. Right. And I'm kind of curious if you have any advice for writing these action heavy scenes for other writers.
Yeah, I will say, like, overall, I wanted this to be a more fast-paced story. So I was aware kind of from the jump that I needed to have action, like you said, like literal action fighting, but also just like, it's more than just fighting, right? Like, action is just about things happening. Your characters constantly being confronted with things that force them to react, like not just kind of strolling, like there has to be things constantly kind of interrupting their pursuit of their goal. So that was something I kind of pushed myself to do. In terms of action, I guess it's kind of like a bit like we were talking about earlier, like your world building informs everything in your story. So if I am a magic user and I am confronted with a problem, like I'm going to lean on, like it's just like in real life, if you have a certain skill set, if I'm a fast runner and I'm being pursued, I'm going to run, like, or, like if I'm super strong or I have a gun or whatever it is, right? Like you sort of set up certain like skills or whatever for each character. And again, I mentioned Avatar: The Last Airbender. Like that's such a great example of magic world building and how the characters each uniquely kind of solve problems with their abilities. And it's really fun and satisfying to watch. So that was, again, as inspiration kind of top of my mind. So I wanted to make sure that I showed the characters solving their problems with their magic. But also, they have to fail a lot too, right? That's part of story. So they can't be like overpowered or too, like you can't have them solve their problems super easily, but there is satisfaction in them kind of like stumbling and then finally getting there and figuring things out. And for Bonesmith, it was about Ren and Julian learning how to work together. They both have, impressive skill sets, but they don't know how to work together, or, they don't like each other. So that was part of the fun and the tension. But action scenes, I mean, they require a lot of choreography. I think good ones. And I don't think I'm an expert on it, but I've tried really hard to, I think a visual person, being that I was into art and everything. I think so, like, it's really important to describe things as well as you can that people can picture it, because then they can kind of understand what's going on. it's also really great if you've set up a character's abilities and then you get to see them use it to solve a problem. Otherwise, if you just kind of throw in new things at the last minute, that can sometimes feel like unearned. So that's, but sometimes that happens anyway, story. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a result of building your world a certain way, building your characters a certain way. Like that's another thing to keep in mind. It's kind of like people will say about like musicals or even like romances, like a song in a story needs to like move the plot forward and convey character and it's kind of the same with action. Like if it's just action and generic and it could happen between any two people in any story, then it's really quite like boring. But what makes it special is it's in your story with your characters and your magic in your world. So like, just for example, Ren's always like running headlong in and not really thinking things through. And Julian's like, man, like slow your roll, simmer down, let's think this through. So like that came into play in their action scenes where like the first time they fight together, he's like really frustrated with her because she just does what she wants, fights alone, like doesn't think of him at all really. So like that's important, I think, to include, like to make sure you're showing who they are as people in your action scenes. It gives you room for character development, for tension, and making sure it's, like I said, it's not generic. It's not just any old sword fight or any old whatever, again, like sword fight, but it's a bone sword, or Julian has an iron sword that breaks off into like a whip. And like, so making sure they use the tools that they have, it makes it unique and it makes it your story, your fight scene. But yeah, they take a lot of, I would say like a lot of times I'll have to step back and like choreograph it a little, like who's where, like, making sure you account for everything. So they can take a while, but, I think I am like visual, so they're not super hard for me. I know for some people they can be a real challenge, but I think I can picture them well enough that it's just a matter of like writing it down, making sure it's clear, and then, yeah.
At the end of book 1, Bonesmith, there's a lot of, I guess you could say, nefarious plots that are revealed to the main characters. And then the ending of Ghostsmith also includes revelations. Did you always know the ending of the series, or were you kind of plotting it out as you went?
I always tend to know like a rough idea. Like I said, I originally was thinking of a trilogy, so there were different elements and things change in the writing. Like no matter how well I've outlined, things tend to change. And then whatever changes in the first book trickles down to like the next book. So I had some ideas of, what I thought the final battle would be and, kind of a rough idea of the players and what was happening, but the intricacies and the details change as you go. So there was definitely like more. I tend to, because plotting is not my strength, I think I tend to over plot and make things like really complicated because I'm like afraid of, I don't know why I do that, but I do. So I tend to have like, I'm always like layering in more stuff. In the first book, there was a lot of like extra stuff I added in, just, things happening at the wall and things got more complicated. And I think one of the things that my editor often pushes me to do is like make things connect. Like if a character's in the book, like, can you connect them to more things? Can you have them, so like there's a character named Odile that Ren meets at the wall kind of early in the first book. And she was sort of kind of throwaway character, but, my editor's like, what else? Like, who else could she know? Or what else could she do? Like, can you push people to have more interesting connections? Same thing happened in my last series. Like, what if this character is related to this character? Or what if, like kind of tightening your story and making sure you don't have kind of superfluous characters who aren't connected to everything. So it ends up making everything really tightly connected. And so there's lots to discover and everyone knows something or is connected to someone that you don't realize, like there's more to discover. So like I said, I think I overplot a little, and then my editor kind of pushes me to make sure that people have, interesting backstories, interesting connections. So I certainly didn't know all the layers to all the reveals, but I think I knew kind of broad strokes, like this one's lying and these two are probably working together, and then like figuring out the nuts and bolts of it is part of like the drafting and revision. Like I'm a really big fan of revising. That's like my favorite part, even though it's the hardest. That's when the story really kind of becomes what I imagined. Like I'm imagining a complicated plot, but I write a first draft and it's pretty simple. And then, you kind of layer in more stuff, and then it becomes really kind of tangled. So it's like a vague idea that takes a little while to get to, but yeah, it changes a lot, honestly, in the writing.
And you mentioned earlier that you kind of take learnings from your previous books and from that writing process and kind of bring it with you as you go along. Is there anything you've learned from writing the House of the Dead series that you'll either bring to your future books or that you will leave behind in the series?
Oh, that's a good question. I do think I'm getting better at not info dumping, even though I still do it. Like I think I'm forever hopefully getting better at figuring out how have a complex world with lots to discover and having it happen a little more naturally. So that's something I think like ongoing learning process. I think I like the pace of it. And that's just a good stylistic choice, but I enjoy, like, I think that works well. Readers seem to be responding to it. So like, that's something I like that. I think I'm going to try and push that a little more. I think there's just new like goals too as a writer. It's not always about maybe learning a lesson as it is. Like, it's still reactive, but it's like, it's funny. Like I tried to make Bonesmith my most romance forward story, but I can't help myself with all the world building and stuff. So I see lots of reviews where people are like, the romance is barely there, but it's worth it. I'm like, barely there. Like, I tried really hard to make this romantic. So like, I'm recognizing that I love the world building. I love all the political machinations. Like, I like all that stuff. So it tends to maybe not drown out, but when I look back, I'm like, yeah, the romance is like one of many things going on. So I still want to try and make myself write a more romance forward story. Like, that's kind of my goal. I'm like, can I actually do this? Like, I love romance, but I love world building and I love all these things. And it ends up being like my plots never rely wholly on the romance. And obviously that's the difference between like a fantasy and like a romance, but I'm trying to push myself to do better at that. I am trying to push myself to do better at the world building stuff. Try to think if there's any lessons of, like I want to avoid magic. Magic is so hard. So hard. And this one was, it's always, I think my first two, all my books actually have a lot of magic, and people seem to like my magic systems, but man, like I said, I'm so like obsessed with like logic that they make me crazy. So a part of me would like to write a story where magic is not so integral and it's not so like complicated. And so like,
there's a lot of rules to figure out.
Yes.
And keep track of. So I can't imagine.
I don't keep track of it. I try, but they change in the writing. Like, I'll create rules. I'll create a whole, document. And then I start writing the story. I'm like, oh, what if she could do this? And I change it, and I'm always kind of, because I do believe that everything should ultimately serve the story. Like, story is king. So like, if it's going to make the story better, I'm going to change it. So it is a struggle. And like, Ghostsmith had some, like I said, weird, unhinged magic. And like, I went for it, but it is hard. So a part of me would like to write a story where the magic is sort of simple or maybe secondary, and like, just to give myself a bit of a break. But it's so satisfying. Again, I keep mentioning Avatar: The Last Airbender, but like, when a magic system's done well, it's so satisfying and so fun to watch or read. And I totally, like, I know I'm not done with magic systems, but I'm like, I would love to write, nice little soft magic system where no one really knows what's going on and it's fine. But no, I always write these like super complicated, plot, like really integral to plot magic. I'm like, oh, Nicki, stop doing that. So that's part of my answer. Lay off the magic a little bit, give myself a break. But yeah, it won't be the end. It won't be the last complicated magic system I write, surely. My middle grade is getting there already. So,
Well, I can't wait to read the very light on magic romance that
Yes.
you will be eventually publishing.
Well, I failed at setting out to write a single point of view story, so don't hold your breath, because it'll probably be multiple point of view, light on the romance with a ton of magic,
Honestly, sounds great either way.
Right? And I love, it's funny, like I love to read stories like that. It just, as a writer, it's like, whew, why do I make this so hard on myself? Same with the super long books. Like, I will say, I tried really hard to make Bonesmith and Ghostsmith not as long as The Crown of Feathers. And I did succeed at that, but they're still long. They're still over 100,000 words, which is pretty long. And for YA. So, I'm like, I'm always striving to get like a shorter book, because it's just, Heart of Flames is my longest book. It's 200,000 words. That's literally like 2 books. Like, I'm writing 2 books in the time that other writers are writing 1. I'm like, why am I doing this to myself? So that's an ever-present concern as well. Keep the word count down. Make things a little easier on yourself, Nicki.
Well, I'm very cognizant of the time. And before we let you go for the rest of your day, could you please tell our listeners where to find you online?
Oh, yes. Instagram is the place I'm most, that's the only one I have, really. It's my name, Nicki Pau Preto, at Nicki Pau Preto. And you can check my website, too, for like, information, buy links and stuff about the books. But yeah, Instagram is the best place to find me. I'm not super present there, but I do check it, so if you're popping in or messaging me, I usually see it. So that would be the best place.
Amazing. We will include links to your website, Instagram, and of course, your books in our show notes. And Nicki, thank you so much for hanging out and chatting with us today. This has been so much fun.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you so much. It was super fun.
Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you are interested in picking up Nicki's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you are enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at KoboWritingLife.com, and be sure you're following us on socials. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook and Twitter, and at kobo.writing.life on Instagram. This episode was hosted by Laura Granger and Rachel Wharton, with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker, and a huge thanks to Nicki for being our guest. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.